Hello everybody and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading the book Patricia St. John Tells Her Own Story by Patricia St. John with permission of Tenethos Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 14, The Hospital at Tangier. The Tulloch Memorial Hospital stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Straits of Gibraltar. On a clear day you could look across to the rock crouching in the sea, like a grand old lion, and behind it the coast of Spain. To the west the straits broadened out into the Atlantic, and by the light of those wild sunsets the great historic sights were almost visible. Cape St. Vincent, Cadiz, and Trafalgar. The east one turns to the beautiful curve of the Tangier Bay, nowadays an extended city of high-rise hotels, flats, and tarmac roads. But when I first went there, the empty golden beaches rose into rolling hills reached by ruttered tracks, so dead and brown in summer, so emerald and flowered when the rains fell. The hospital had been started in 1889 by Dr. Churcher in an improvised Moorish stable, and named after young Edwina Tulloch, who had died of typhoid fever in her first year of missionary service. Others had followed, and a building had been erected to house 20 inpatients, an operating theater, and an outpatient clinic. In 1938, a large new wing was added for outpatients, radiology, and a dispenser. A ward for TB patients was built on top of this, and towards the middle of the century had become a small, modern, well-equipped hospital. The only mission hospital in the whole of North Africa's Islamic belt as far as Egypt. It had a heroic history. Doctors and nurses had labored and died, while some had hung on single-handed. In 1906, during a typhus epidemic, not only was the hospital crammed with patients, but the sick had erected tents in the streets around so as to be within reach of the only source of help and comfort. Dr. Roberts and Nurse Ida Smith, weakened by overwork and lack of sleep, both succumbed to the disease and died within a week. Then, with no medical staff left, it seemed as if the light might go out, but it never quite did. By the end of the week, Ida's sister, Georgina, also a nurse, had arrived to do what she could until further help was sent. She too died within a few years, probably also of typhus, but the little hospital remained open. In those days, and for a long time afterwards, it was the only place for hundreds of miles round where the very poor could be treated free, and they came by the thousands, sometimes from distances of 100 miles or so, trudging down the mountainous tracks from distant villages, bumping along rutted roads on donkeyback or in rattling buses. They came and came and came. In the busy outpatient department, an effort was made to keep the numbers of morning patients down to 120, and to see them in order of arrival, some for the doctor, some for nurses, and some for X-ray. It was extremely difficult to do this satisfactorily, as the sick started to arrive at 4 a.m. They were given boards with numbers, but many could not read those numbers, and names were a little better as an identification, because about the half of the people who came were called Fatima or Muhammad. Surnames and addresses were vague. Their tricks for jumping the line were endless. Some would bribe the early comers to change boards. Some would try to erase the 0 from the 100. Sometimes a solitary, innocent-looking woman would suddenly lift her cover, and out of its fold would emerge a cluster of children, like chickens from under a mother's wings. Each needed to see the doctor, she would assure us, but she didn't want to bother anybody by getting more than one board. When the doors were shut, the more determined would sneak around the garden and hide behind the bush at the nurse's entrance, hoping to creep in under cover of one of them going into work. If caught, they would consider it extremely funny and expect all to take the same view, not always shared by somewhat weary and exasperated staff. When the waiting room was full, a short gospel message was given by one of the workers, usually under very difficult circumstances. The speaker must have felt very often that it was an impossible task to gain attention from any of the 120 or so parked along the waiting room benches, pushing in at the door, squatting on the floor, etc. However, over the years we heard of some who heard, listened, and came again just for the message, several times repeated each morning, and began to think seriously about the Lord Jesus from that simple introduction. My brother Farnham joined the hospital staff in 1945 and assisted Dr. Anderson until 1948, when he himself became the medical superintendent until 1975. the year in which the Moroccan government took over the hospital, putting in their own staff. Farnham was, I think, in some ways the most Christ-like man I have ever known. He had certain advantages. His wife Janet was a skilled GP and acted as anesthesiologist, making a perfect complement to himself in every way. He had a great gift for understanding, picking up and using languages, and as he quickly acquired a very good grasp of Arabic, as he had already studied French and Spanish, he was well equipped to cope with the multicultural environment of Tangier. Then there were the staff. 2 doctors later joined him, Julian Carlisle from Harrow, UK, and William or Bill Campbell from the States, both with special skills and both more involved in the medical rather than the surgical side of the work, which is Farnham's prerogative. Both were 2 brothers in life and work of the hospital. The nurses, too, were a loyal and dedicated team. Not that they always approved of Farnham. His amazing capacity for work could leave frailer souls in despair, and the saints can sometimes seem exasperating to the least saintly. But they were loyal to his principles, and on the whole they loved him and recognized him for what he was, a man of God. Through the long, grinding, and often disappointing years, he never lost that God-given characteristic of seeing the individual as special and unique, that will leave the 99 and go after the one. In that hot, thronged, clamoring outpatients, with its milling crowds, including the rude, the impatient, and the totally unconventional, he looked with unhurried compassion and understanding on each, and his patients knew it and almost worshipped him. He could not bear to send anyone away unhelped or abandoned. He would go up to the wards with some travel-stained old man from the mountains who needed an eye operation and a bed for the night, and having been finally vanquished by the nurses, no, repeat no, there is absolutely no hope of a bed. It is quite impossible to admit anyone. He would look thoughtful. There was probably a corner down at the house. Janet could rig up something. There was, in fact, a tiny guest room which Janet kept immaculate, as guests of all nationalities had a way of arriving at all hours, often quite unexpectedly. One such visitor arrived from England, and Janet led her confidently to the little room where the bed had been made up with clean sheets. It was a shock to the lady to find a grisly head on the pillow, its eyes covered with a blood-stained bandage. Farnham never could resist the sight of an empty bed. He was an accomplished surgeon, and as later government hospitals and private clinics opened in the town, he specialized more and more in eye surgery. In 1963, he went back to England to take his diploma of ophthalmology to be better equipped to set up a special eye department in the hospital. Before that, the hospital had to cope with anything and everything surgical and medical. Here he often experienced God's enabling in a wonderful way. He told of a morning when he was crossing from his home to the operating theater. He was stopped by a tourist. The man explained he was a surgeon on holidays, and having heard about the hospital, he wondered if he might watch a few operations. It was an unusual request, but Farnham agreed gladly and invited him to assist. All went well until a patient was brought in with what had seemed to be a perforated gastric ulcer, a common, relatively simple surgical emergency. However, when the abdomen was opened, there turned out to be not so, but a rare condition requiring an operation Farnham had never done before. Farnham decided he would have to work from the surgical manual. It was then that the visiting surgeon, or was he an angel in disguise, made his quiet offer. "Would you like me to take over? It just happens that I have specialized in this condition." Swiftly and with expertise, the operation was performed while Farnham watched and learned and thanked God. Farnham's early letters back to his parents show what high hopes he went out to Tangier, how intense his interest was in his patients, what joy he felt over surgical triumphs, and what spiritual longing he had for those around him. The realization of the crushing strength of Islam dawned on him quite quickly, as extracts from his letters show. The men are very difficult. I can well understand why so many men missionaries from this country have gone home in despair. They seem so unresponsive, and there are complications here everywhere you turn. Every avenue through which you might approach them seems blocked. They read and pray so easily, but not one of them is out and out for the Lord, and it seems to mean nothing to them. The church here at present is very small and very dead, but it is simple and run on New Testament lines. It would be wonderful if the Spirit of God breathed on it. More and more he was coming to depend on the power of prayer, his own prayers and the prayers of others. He wrote, "Unless I am careful about the planning of each day, things pile up and I go to bed late and have no inclination to get up in the morning." The old, old story. Through reading Behind the Ranges, The Life of J.O. Frazier, I have been shown afresh the value of systematic prayer for those who are one with us in the work. My heart is so crushed by the news we have just received that our only baptized unmarried girl on the compound has become secretly engaged to a Muslim. You can well imagine, when there were so few, how precious each one is, and what a bitter blow an event like this is to the little church. It would have been prevented, I feel, if someone had been praying for her regularly. I would like to ask a half a dozen or so of you friends at home to attach yourself each to one of these Moorish converts out here. If each was hedged about with prayer, it might prevent the devil making off with the next one. One never knows when he is planning to strike next. Would you undertake to pray for this really faithfully every day and again? The forces against us are so strong that unless we are prepared to put everything into fight, we shall get nowhere. At present we are suffering defeat after defeat in this battlefield, and your letter has come to me as a warning. I realize that the situation will continue to deteriorate unless a counterattack of the most costly nature is made. God's message to me yesterday from Hebrews 12, "Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin." I was given the same words on my birthday in the words of Ramul Lul, who wrote 600 years ago, "It seems to me that the Holy Land cannot be won in any other way than that whereby thou, O Lord Jesus, and thine apostles won it, by faith and prayer and the shedding of blood and tears." But it wasn't all sadness. There were flashes of joy over reports of other work, or some gleam of light from the Bible. He wrote, "I loved hearing about F., a worker in southern Morocco, and the 5 years with no results followed by blessing, and now there are 30 meeting together to worship. It made me scream with joy. Perhaps one day I can go down and visit there." I have just read Revelation in Arabic, and parts of it made me cry, because it was so wonderful to know that one day poor Hamad and Fatima will walk in white raiments and have all their tears wiped away. If only more of these people in Morocco could hear the gospel. He saw clues and pointers to blessing in the lives of some older missionaries. Miss Glenn, in whose house he chose to live when he first arrived in Tangier, has worked here for 35 years and shows no sign of weakening. She has survived typhoid and cancer and has seen results because she has given her whole life to the people. Example, she always has them living with her. This, of course, calls for the sacrifice of all privacy, but it wins their lives. Perhaps it's not possible for married people to live like this, and it illustrates what St. Paul writes. The unmarried man cares for the things of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7:32. Miss Glenn and Mr. Elson, who ran a school for the orphan boys, will have a great welcome from all their girls and boys in heaven. Yet, as the years went by, there was a quiet work of grace going on in a few hearts. But not until 1955 was he allowed to see an open, obvious move of the Spirit. It was in that year that Farnham wrote an account of Sunday afternoon service in Tangier. It was during the annual Moroccan Christian Conference, and 5 had been baptized. Mr. Acton spoke well on the first chapters of Acts, and many were helped, especially the girls. The men always seemed slower, but A. from Tatton and the 2 exempted boys gave good testimony. A. from the TB ward has been hotly attacked this week. There are some fanatical Muslims up there who seem determined to get rid of him or his faith. Sunday night. Thank you so much for praying for us. We've had a wonderful day. Heaven on earth. God has really spoken to people, and we have seen hard, matter-of-fact Muslims converted and deeply convicted of sin. I am deeply convicted for my lack of faith. Mr. Bocking took the afternoon meeting and put up a blackboard with a simple picture of the way of life and the way of death. Then he drew a book underneath and asked anyone who wanted to become Christians to come up and sign their names in the book of life. There were some very mocking men present, and I did not expect anyone to come forward. But 10 girls went up to the front. Among them were T, with her plaster leg, and Z on her crutches, and F, who's always been so proud, but still no men. After the meeting, L came to me and said, "Go up to your brother's room. He needs you." A, her brother has always been very nice and sensible, but has never given any indication of interest in Christianity. He works as an orderly in the men's ward and is in fact a well-taught Quranic student. I went to his room and found him crying. He said he must accept Christ and give his testimony in the church that night. He was very upset about his formal, immoral life, but now knows that Christ has forgiven him. So we had a beautiful last meeting when A spoke on grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, a verse that seemed to fascinate him. After that, Mr. Acton spoke on prayer in the church, and we had a prayer meeting. Rejoice with us. We have seen today that God can save anyone, and I'm sure it is only a beginning. Pray much for the men in the TB ward. They have heard all about it and are furious. But God is greater, and if they kill us, at least we can say, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen your salvation." There were many ups and downs, and discouragements often came in clusters to knock out the faithful, often weary workers. Of the small group of Christians in Tangier, several, and it seems to us always the most gifted and the most needed, died young. And of those we can speak freely. H, converted in Mr. Elson's school as a lad, survived 2 years of cruel punishment for his faith. This is a long chapter, so we're going to do this in 2 parts, and tomorrow we'll finish the second part to chapter 14. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.